My name is Tom, and I'd like to share a story from my college days. As you can probably imagine, it's not a very nice story, but I like to think that it's something others can take something away from, be that a life lesson or whatever else. I was pretty wild in college. You wouldn't think it if you looked at me, but it's true. I did okay in my freshman year, tried to keep my head straight and focus on my studies, but then the sophomore party lifestyle hit me pretty hard. I've also always looked a little older than I was, so although getting carded was standard on campus, if I drove into the city, I could pick up a six-pack almost anywhere. And that was not conducive to a healthy study and party balance. I would regularly find myself forced to walk home from some bar at 2 a.m., having spent all my money on shots with no charge on my phone to call a cab. A normal person might have that happen to them once, but me, it happened at least half a dozen times than I can remember. The last time, I had just gotten back onto campus after walking maybe 2 or 3 miles completely drunk, and I was incredibly tired. I was sobering up, in a terrible mood, and all I wanted to do was get back to my dorm so I could get to that bottle of vodka that I kept hidden in my dorm. But then, I run into this kindly stranger. There's a guy smoking a cigarette outside his block, and he says something sort of softly to me as I walk past him. It was something like, "Crazy night," or "Wild night," and I must have just grunted until I saw him smoking. I asked him to bum one and did so. Then we made a little small talk before he invited me inside for a beer and to charge my phone. This guy was still living in the dorms, albeit the nicer kind on the other side of campus, but having alcohol was still very much against the rules. Most heavy partiers had something stashed away somewhere, but this guy had a mini fridge that had beer cans tucked behind sodas. He said no one suspected him because he was such a nerd, and he was kind of right. I guess, because he didn't give off party vibes, but I just found myself seriously impressed. Well, more just wanting to have another beer before I walked the final 20 minutes to my dorm, but impressed nevertheless. I go up to this guy's room, and there it was, beer, hiding in plain sight. I asked to use the guy's bathroom before we drank, and he showed me where it was. And when I got back, we talked and drank, and at one point, I knew I probably should have started walking back, but I figured that I could just rest a little longer. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the last thing I remember. I woke up the next morning in the hallway outside the guy's apartment. I was fully clothed, but my shoes were out there with me. It must have been late morning because it was pretty busy outside, meaning people definitely must have stepped over me while passed out in the hallway. I felt like death, and I probably looked about the same too. I know I attracted a few looks as I sort of moseyed across campus and back to my room. I've been really drunk before, but never blackout drunk, and let me tell you, it was not a good feeling. I haven't even put it together why I'd been cruising along just fine before that one beer knocked me out completely cold. I honestly just figured that I was exhausted from hours of drinking, then miles of walking, but as I said, I had made that walk 5 or 6 times previous, probably having drank even more on some occasions, and I'd never blacked out like that until that night. I figured a lot of you probably have put it together already. Things are sometimes clearer from a distance like that, you know? But never underestimate the power of denial, especially when it comes to young men. I think a year went by before I was really faced with what had happened to me. I always knew in the back of my head, but like I'd already covered, I had that head buried firmly in the sand. In the 12 months or so since I blacked out, the same thing happened to multiple guys from our university and even some of the locals too. They were walking someplace late at night, ran into a kind of stranger who offered them beer or maybe a phone charge or whatever they just happened to need at that moment. They then went up to this guy's apartment or got into his car or whatever, and he offers them a drink. And then boom, they wake up hours later with no memory of the evening's events. You might think that it'd be those with clear ideas or suspicions that'd be the first to raise the alarm, but in reality, the opposite is true. The more of an idea that they had of what happened, the more compartmentalizing went on, allowing our seemingly kind stranger to get away with his crimes for a long time. It wasn't until a dude went to a doctor, having no idea why he hurt so much, that the cops were even informed that something was going on campus. Then I don't know how, but they caught up with the guy, arrested him, and then the whole story was in the media within just a few days. The cops think this kindly stranger assaulted anywhere between 18 to 100 different assaults in the space of 2 years. And you read that right. 18 confirmed, 100 possible. And I heard almost a dozen were almost talked into testifying, but withdrew one by one in the run-up to the trial itself. Testifying would mean admitting what had happened to them, something that some guys just aren't willing to do. I guess that applies to both sexes, but it especially applies to men. I know that because I was one of those who withdrew. I figured if so many others were brave enough to say it out loud, I wouldn't need to. But that's not how it works. The kindly stranger who invited me into his dorm room that night got more than 500 years in prison on account of the 18 separate accounts that he was convicted of, plus a bunch of other crimes thrown in there too. It was good news to most, but to me, it meant facing up to what had happened to me, which honestly has been the single toughest thing I'd ever had to do. I've since worked with an organization called 1 in 6, named so because statistically, 1 in 6 men will be intimately assaulted or violated at some point in their lives. But because of how little we talk about it, you'd think the number is much, much lower. Well, it's not. And if the issues I just discussed affects any of your viewers, I strongly advise them to go visit www.oneinsix.org. There's a lot of advice and information there. Just don't close yourselves off and suffer in silence, because silence is the real killer. So back when I was in college here in Germany, me and a few friends of mine were invited to a house party one weekend. It wasn't sold as being some crazy all-night rave or anything like that, but since the drinking age is much lower than in the US, there'd been a lot of beer, and it was certain to get pretty wild. In light of that, me and my friends were really excited. We knew that there were going to be girls, and being the young single guys that we were, we knew that it'd be a great place to meet some potential dates and, do some flirting. We arrived stinking of cologne, wearing terrible button-up shirts with our beer in tow, and then we set up in the corner and just sort of awkwardly were drinking amongst ourselves for a while. But then the more we drank, the more confident we got, and slowly but surely we started to mingle. One of my friends started putting it on with a few different girls, and at first it was funny to watch him struggle. He was our designated driver for the evening, meaning that he hadn't been drinking and was therefore still very nervous and pretty clumsy. But then, we saw that the attraction to one of the girls was very much reciprocated. We were happy for him, but as much as I'd like to tell you that we were mature and gave him some space, that wasn't the case at all. We kept harassing him and his potential date, playfully of course, but it was still unwelcome. Eventually, he told us to leave them alone because we were ruining his chances with her, and only then did we finally respect his wishes and just leave him in peace. We were pretty drunk by that period, so we just went off and entertained ourselves so he could get some space. Now, a little time goes by and we start wondering where our sober friend and his lady are. We looked around everywhere for them, checking all of the bedrooms in the house, but all were occupied with people drinking or smoking, and our friend seemed to be nowhere to be seen. But then, in the process of looking for him, we found the girl's friends, and after asking where the new couple was, we discovered that they'd gone out to my friend's car for some alone time together. We knew exactly what they were up to, and although the girl's friends made us promise to leave them alone, we just had to get a picture or two for posterity, being immature and whatnot, you know the deal. I fully admit that our plan made us total a-holes and that violating someone's intimate privacy is not only wrong, but also completely against the law, to be honest, and we didn't end up taking pictures or video of anyone that night, as you'll soon come to learn. In order to maintain the element of stealth, only one of us would creep up towards my friend's car before secretly recording whatever was going on inside. That was the plan, at least. And that person wasn't me, so the rest of us sort of held back at the party to make it look like we weren't doing exactly what it is we were doing. We talked to the girl's friends, kept them occupied trying and failing to flirt with them until we started to grow impatient. All our friend with the phone had to do was run up to the car, snap a few pictures, and then run back with his prize. But longer and longer went by and there was no sign of our friend with the camera phone. Unable to wait any longer, I went outside to look for him, but instead of secretly filming our friend and his girl in the car, I found him sitting on the curb with no car in sight. He was on the phone with someone, so I figured shutting up and listening would get more answers than asking questions he wouldn't respond to. As I listened, I worked out the call was obviously a serious one, and by the end of it, I was almost certain that number one, he'd been crying, and number two, that the call sounded like it had been with the police. I asked him where our friend with the car was, and he just shook his head and told me we need to leave. When he looked up at me, it became clear that yes, he had been crying, but why? He didn't tell me until we took a taxi back to his apartment, and over a few more beers and some cigarettes, he told me what happened. He tried to take some pictures as planned, but when he got to our friend's car, he found him in the passenger seat alone. His head was in his hands, and he was in this terrible state with tears streaming down his face. My friend with the phone kept asking what happened with the girl, over and over, but our friend with the car wouldn't say anything. Wouldn't or couldn't, I don't know. But my phone friend walks around to the passenger side to climb in and talk to him with some privacy, and he asks again, what happened with the girl? And our friend with the car just points to the back seat. And that's when he realizes that our friend isn't alone in the car. He never was. And that under the blanket on the back seat, he recognized the shape of a person. It was the girl that he'd been with, and she wasn't breathing. But when my friend with the phone asked what had happened, car friend just kept saying, I don't know. At first, he maybe thought that the girl had had a seizure or maybe a freak heart failure, and he kept saying to call 112, which is the emergency number here in Germany for fire or medical. But my friend with the car, he wouldn't call. He kept saying things like, just wait a minute, I need to think, and other things to delay my other friend. My friend with the phone said that he jumped out of the car out of instinct, realizing that he was getting his DNA and all of those things onto what was now the scene of the crime, being very paranoid. There was no other reason why he would refuse to call the emergency number or try to delay in any way, or why he'd cover her body instead of just running to get help or maybe even trying to get her out. My friend with the phone then told the other to get out of his car, but he wouldn't. He just suddenly started the engine and drove off before my friend could stop him. He then was faced with a choice: run and get us, which is what he really wanted to do because he was completely freaked out, or do the right thing, be a man and just call the 110 number instead, which is not the number for medical, it's the number for the police. We later discovered that the friend with the car had somehow suffocated this girl, although we never found out exactly how. He planned to drive into the River Main to take his own life and hide what he'd done, but he couldn't go through with it and was found by the police and subsequently arrested. He pled guilty to everything to try and get as little time in prison as possible, and for a while it was a big story. But now, for most people, it's half a forgotten memory, really. When I recall it, my mind always seemed to land on one specific thing my friend said when he was in his apartment afterwards. He said realizing that he sat in the car with a dead body, as well as the killer themselves, was the scariest feeling he'd ever felt. It's the kind of moment that would top anybody's list of their life's scariest moments. But he said that just seconds later he was faced with something that was somehow even more terrifying to him. He was terrified that one of the dead girl's friends was going to ask him where she was, and how he wouldn't be able to tell her. I just tried to be the best friend I could to him, and get him away from the party before his worst fear came true. But I also understand how selfish it was of us not to warn anyone what had happened. Those girls might have carried on partying for a while, not knowing that one of their close friends was gone forever.
This is something that happened during my freshman year of college. It was a few years ago now, but I still remember it like it was yesterday. At the time, I went to a university with about 10,000 students. For my first year, I lived in an all-female dorm building on the 3rd floor. There were 4 floors total, and I had my own dorm room all to myself. On probably the 3rd or 4th week of school, I went to bed one night just like any other. It was a weeknight, but I don't remember exactly what day. I woke up though at around 3 o'clock in the morning and really had to use the bathroom. The bathrooms were just a ways down the hallway, so I got out of bed and headed to the door. When I got out into the hallway, it was empty and things were very quiet. I had to walk maybe between 50 and 100 feet to get to the bathrooms. Once I was there, the bathrooms that we had was basically a room with 5 doors and a sink. Each door was its own little private bathroom. Nobody was inside, and all of the doors were open when I got there. Not surprising for it being 3 o'clock in the morning. As I was inside one of the rooms, I heard footsteps come from the hallway. Whoever it was then entered the bathrooms and went into one of the rooms across from me. I didn't think too much of it. I was inside for maybe a minute and then left. When I did, the other person was still inside the one across from me. Basically, right when I got back into the hallway, I heard the other bathroom door open. Then, when I was maybe 30 feet away from the bathrooms walking to my room, I heard them start walking in the hallway behind me. I still didn't think much of it at the time, and I expected it to be another girl. But something about it just seemed odd. I don't really know why. I looked over my shoulder to see who it was, but when I did, I saw that it was a man. And it wasn't a college-aged man either. This guy looked much older than me. I was really confused by this. I turned back and kept walking for my room, but instantly I heard the man speed up his steps. He was walking pretty fast and starting to gain on me. I got a really bad feeling and I sped up as well. By now, I was pretty close to my door, and I hadn't locked it with me only going to the bathroom. That was good, meaning I could get inside faster. I could hear the man still getting closer and closer to me, and I started to feel panic setting into my mind. Now I was only about 10 feet away, and the guy was less than 20 feet behind me. When I got to the door, I quickly opened it, got inside, and then shut the door and locked it behind me. Probably a second later, the guy stopped right outside my door. He then tried opening the door, and my heart started racing even faster than it already was. Then he knocked on it. I had no clue who this guy was or what he wanted. I knew that he wasn't supposed to be here though. I chose not to answer the door. I also didn't bother to ask him what he was doing or who he was. There was about 30 seconds of silence after he knocked. I was hoping that he would have gone away, but then he knocked on the door again. It wasn't a very loud knock at all, and after he knocked, I walked over to the door and looked through the peephole. He was sort of short and wearing a black jacket and had sort of blonde hair. I didn't know who he was. He definitely didn't work at the school or anything either. He knocked again for a 3rd time. I really wanted him to just go away. There was no way that I was going to be able to get any sleep with this guy here. He didn't say anything the entire time, but was just standing there. I went away from the door and sat on my bed. I waited, and the guy didn't knock for a really long time. But when I went back over to the door and looked out, thinking maybe he was gone, the guy was still there. I didn't know what to do. I walked back over to my bed. Then the guy knocked one more time. It was really quiet, and I just barely heard it because of how quiet it was. I didn't get up to look. I stayed where I was, and probably 10 more minutes went by. I didn't hear any noises and got up to look again. That's when I saw that the guy was finally gone. After that, I was finally able to get back to sleep. The next morning, I found my resident advisor and told her about the man. She said that she was going to report it. Luckily, I never saw the guy again after that. A few days later, though, I found out that the man had been let into the building much earlier that night. He had told a student that his daughter lived there and he had to give her something. The student let him in, believing his story. It turned out that it was a complete lie, and he must have hid somewhere for hours. I get really creeped out thinking about it. Campus security was informed of the situation, but I never heard anything more of him. In fall of 2019, I was a freshman in college. I went to a smaller school and I lived in the dorms. I had a roommate named Danny who was a real jerk, but that's not the horror story. Sure, it was annoying to be in that small dorm room with Danny. He would talk a lot and pester me on purpose a lot of times. Because of this, I tried to spend as much time away from our dorm room as possible. I would do all my studying in different places around campus. Spots to sit and get work done were everywhere, in just about every building. Even if I wasn't doing homework, I could sit and watch YouTube videos or whatever. I preferred it to being in my dorm room if Danny was there. I got into a routine of this after probably the first month. So one night, I remember that I was doing homework in this one building. It was the building that a lot of our classrooms were in and had several different subjects. There were about 4 floors to it, and I was up on the 3rd or 4th floor, but I don't remember which one. I was in a comfortable chair that had a table attached to it. It was built for studying and stuff. There were a few of these types of chairs that looked out a window that had a nice view of campus. I took a break at about 6 p.m. and went to the dining hall to eat. I met up with a friend there, and then afterwards went back to the same building at the same spot that I was at before to finish my homework. The buildings didn't close if you were a student, and you could stay there as long as you wanted. By now, especially up on one of the top floors, things were very quiet, and nobody else was really around. I kept working, and was there until probably like 9 p.m. As I worked, I had my headphones in, and played some music in the background. Sometimes I would do that, and sometimes I wouldn't. It just depended on what I was doing and how I felt. So right after I was done, and I took my headphones out, I heard footsteps behind me immediately. The walkway went behind me, and one direction led to some classrooms, and the other led to some stairs. The footsteps were coming from the hallway with some classrooms in it. I started picking up my laptop and putting things into my backpack. As I did, the footsteps got closer and closer. It didn't seem like the person was going to walk by me, though. It almost seemed like they were going to approach me instead. I turned around to look and see who it was. All I saw, though, was somebody ducking around a corner behind a beam. I didn't get a look at the person, but just saw part of them for like a second. This was kind of weird. I finished putting my things in my backpack and then stood up, looking to where I saw the person again. I still saw nothing. Then I walked over to the stairs and left the building. I went back to my dorm after that. But the very next day, there was a similar experience. This time, after studying in a different building, I went to the Performing Arts building to study that night. This building was almost always pretty quiet. There were much less classrooms inside of it, and unless there was a concert or something going on, not many people would be there. I studied in peace for basically the whole time, and saw only about 2 or 3 people walking by in the entire time that I was in there. For the last 2 hours probably, I saw nobody at all. The location that I was studying in was on the 1st floor and next to a staircase where there was a table and chair set up for studying. It was kind of out of the way, but there was a hallway going past and another one that connected. I did not have my headphones in this time and could hear everything around me. Things were very quiet, and it soon got to be kind of late. At one point, though, I heard footsteps coming from down the hallway. Just when these footsteps were about to get into my view, though, they stopped. It was like just around the corner where I couldn't see. There was no room that I was aware of right there either. It was like the person had just stopped in their tracks. If they went back the other way or moved at all, I would have heard them. What were they doing? Were they just standing there? I had no idea. I decided to pack up my stuff and head back to my dorm. When I did, I didn't hear anything. Luckily for me, I did not have to walk past that hallway, and I would be going the other way. When I left, as soon as I started heading down the hallway, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they followed me, but were still out of my sight. Then I heard them start to get closer and within my view. I turned around to see who it was that was there. I did it very quickly to not be weird, so I didn't get a good look at the person, but I did see them. There was a tall and thin-looking guy, walking a little ways back, behind me. It seemed as though he was walking pretty fast. This was way too weird, and as I walked, I passed by an exit door. It wasn't one of the main entrances or exits to the building, but at the last moment, I turned and I left. Once I was out of there, I headed back for the main area of campus. The guy didn't leave the building, whoever it was. I wondered if this was the same person who had been there the previous night. I went back to my dorm room, and after that, decided to take a break from studying around campus at night. As much as I didn't like to study in my dorm room with Danny, it wasn't the worst thing in the world. But the story doesn't quite end there. A few days later, I had classes like normal and was gone for most of the day. I returned to our dorm in the late afternoon, and Danny was there. When I got into the room, he told me that someone had come by and asked for me. Apparently, somebody knocked on our door, and when Danny answered, a guy asked if I was there. I asked Danny what the guy looked like, and he said tall and thin, and basically described the same guy that I had seen the other night. I asked if the guy said what he wanted with me. He didn't say, though. Apparently, he just walked away. After that, I never saw the man again.
The event in question happened during my sophomore year in college, back in 2012. I honestly can't remember the exact month, but I believe it was sometime during the winter. At the time I lived with two roommates, Katie and Danielle, and we were the best buds of all time. We had just moved into our first off-campus house, and we were reveling in the freedom of being out of the dorms. With this turn of events came some experimentation with drugs and alcohol. The three of us began hanging out and partying with a group of people who eventually got into harder drugs, like cocaine and Molly, etc. Katie and I decided after a while that all of this partying was jeopardizing our health and our schoolwork, so we backed off on the drugs. Danielle, however, decided to continue experimenting and became more aggressive. I should note that I hold no judgment toward drug use whatsoever, but I include it because I believe it may be a crucial component of the events that followed. The saga started on a weekend. We all decided to go to a party one night and got separated from each other. I had made arrangements to leave the party early, so Danielle agreed to walk with Caddy back to the house. We were always adamant about the buddy system at night. However, on that night, it failed. Danielle left the party with someone, leaving Katie to walk home by herself. She was unfortunately followed by a strange man. To this day, I deeply regret leaving that night. But I've come to terms with my past decision. I came home the next morning. Katie filled me in on the previous night. She was very upset, which was out of character for her. She told me that she had texted Danielle at some point during the night, telling her that she was very bummed out about having to walk home alone. Katie was frustrated, and her text was blunt, but Caddy and I just figured that Danielle would either brush it off or apologize, and things would move on. That did not happen. Danielle flipped her shit and became completely enraged. She responded very defensively and told Katie, in very colorful terms, to basically fuck off and get over it. We thought it was pretty odd and hostile, but tried to just carry on with our lives and not overthink it. It was a Monday, so Katie left the house to go to work on campus, and I went to my afternoon lecture. Sometime while I was in class, Danielle came into Katie's workplace in the Student Rec Center and began screaming at her in front of 60+ patrons, calling her all kinds of obscenities. She was escorted out of the building by security and somehow made her way back to our house. I should also note that Danielle's mother was visiting this week and was with her the entire time. I believe she was terrified of her daughter, which is why she never intervened. By the time she arrived at home, I had returned from class and was making food in the kitchen. At this juncture, Danielle's rage was centered on Katie, not me. I tried to let the two of them work it out without my intervention, but Danielle cornered me in the kitchen and told me how angry she was with Katie. I have never seen rage in someone's eyes like that. I refused to engage with her and retreated to my room in the back of the house. I sat on my bed and took some deep breaths. That's when I heard Katie coming up the side yard. She was crying on the phone with her mom, telling her what had just taken place at work. I immediately felt this horrible pit in my stomach, as I knew they were about to confront each other again. The door opened, and Katie walked in. I was still in my room when I heard them start yelling at each other. Katie stood up for herself, telling Danielle that she was way out of line, and Danny retorted with more obscenities. The yelling turned into full-on screaming, and I had finally had enough. So I went into the living room where they were arguing. Danielle's mom was there as well. I told Danny to knock it off and leave, to which she told me to go f myself. This gave Katie time to try to bolt into her room, but Danny followed her and slammed Katie's hand in the door as she was trying to barricade herself. Things had gotten way out of hand. I went outside on our front porch, and Katie followed me outside. A few seconds later, we heard Danny's mom screaming for her to put something down. We looked at each other in terror. I told Katie to run away and to call 911. At that moment, Danny flings open the front door, holding a giant kitchen knife raised above her head, and screaming at the top of her lungs at Katie, saying that she was going to kill her. By this time, all of our neighbors were standing outside, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. I'm not a very confrontational person, but like hell was I going to let someone kill my best friend. So in a split-second decision, I lunged at Danny and somehow managed to get the knife away from her and threw it on the front lawn. I ran to grab it, at which time Danielle had gone back inside to grab another knife. This time, she turned it on herself and asked me if I wanted to watch her end it all. Something had gone terribly wrong with Danielle. Her mother was hysterical by this point, and I kept pleading for her to stop. I then blacked out. When I came to, I was running down the street with Katie. We soon took refuge at our neighbor's house. All the while we could still hear Danielle's blood-curdling screams down the street. We were totally shell-shocked, but grateful to our neighbors for helping us out until the police came. We saw the cops show up a short time later, along with a crisis unit. They detained Danny and drove her to the hospital, where she was put on a psychiatric evaluation. Katie and I never saw Danielle again, and we stayed with some mutual friends for a couple of weeks before returning to that house. We moved out at the end of that year, as the place harbored too many bad memories for us. I later learned that Danielle had experienced a psychotic break triggered by a variety of factors, including stress, drug use, and an underlying mental health condition. This was a huge eye-opener for me to further educate myself about mental health in young adults, as well as appreciate the incredible things your body can do while you're in fight or flight mode. It's also taught me a lesson to trust my gut more, as my spidey senses had warned me about Danielle before, but I ignored it. This is somewhat of a convoluted story, so please bear with me as I try to convey everything that I can recall about what led me to the conclusion that my former housemate could have potentially been a serial killer, or one in the making. It was the summer of 2015 when I moved in, and at first appearances my housemate Mike was somewhat normal, if not a bit socially awkward and dysfunctional. When I was signing the papers, he was adamant that I should never go into the basement, which I thought was odd. But I really needed a place to stay, and everyone has their little quirks, so I just chalked it up to that at the time. As I got to know Mike more, I learned about the depths of his dysfunction. Firstly, he used meth. Now, I don't automatically judge people based on vices, but I was surprised at the extent of his use. He is probably the first person I knew who used meth and balanced a full-time job and enjoyed a decent amount of success. The reason this is important to the story is that when he would be around the house, drinking and using, he would start to run off at the mouth, joking that if I smelled lye coming from the basement, to not think anything of it. It was probably the third time he said this that I asked him why he kept saying that. He responds with, "I use chemicals to clean up after the bodies," with a creepy grin on his face. I tried to chalk it up to a bad sense of humor, but it didn't sit right with me. He was also very particular that I let him know about my coming and going and my work schedule. I remember him being shocked and uncomfortable one day that I ended up taking off of work because he didn't realize that I was home. I remember that day because there was a lot of clanging and what sounded like muffled shouting coming from the basement. His car was in the driveway, but he was not in the main house or his bedroom. On other days, he would play very loud music that bumped through the entire house. Sometimes he would even play NPR talk radio at very high volumes. In retrospect, I think he may have been trying to mask sounds. He would make remarks about sex workers, saying, "You can do whatever you want. You can choke them or beat them to death, and nobody cares." I took exception to this, telling him that I thought that was messed up. When he would get to tweaking, he would always come back around to alluding to the same kind of violence, talking about he was a normal guy who owned a house and had a good career, so the police would never suspect him. At this point, I think he has gone too far to simply be joking. I was in a weird position. Money was tight at the time, and I didn't have very many options. I tried to convince myself that even if he was messed up, he probably was just engaging in some outward fantasism. I knew that he would acquire the services of sex workers on occasion, but again, I don't judge that kind of activity at face value. But I was becoming concerned. One day when I was doing laundry, I caught a whiff of decomposition. The house we were in was in southeast Portland and was relatively new. Having grown up in upstate New York, I know that animals can sometimes be trapped in the walls and die. But this was in the garage. There were no animals scurrying about. This was both strange and telling to me. I considered carefully what to do, and decided that I would confront him about the smell. I decided to pose the question in a somewhat suggestive way by expanding on his jokes. I told him that he needs to do a better job of cleaning up the bodies because I could smell the decomposition from the garage. I will never forget his reaction. His eyes widened, and he shot me a sharp glare, somewhere between fear and anger. He stumbled over his words and eventually responded with, "What? Really?" "Yeah, really." There was a few seconds of awkward silence before he said, "Thanks for letting me know." He then promptly went to his bedroom and closed the door. A few days after that, he went into the upper crawl space in the garage while I was doing laundry. He called for me and was trying to convince me to come up to the crawl space. My body locked up. My instincts were screaming at me that if I went up there, I would not come back down. I gave him some excuse about having to go somewhere, packed up my laundry, threw it in my room, and quickly left. He spent a lot of time in the padlocked basement without a doorknob. The only way inside was through the backyard. I wish I would have gone down there in retrospect to either confirm or dismiss my suspicions once and for all. In the last couple of months of living there, I was subjected to more graphic comments about women and sex workers, explicit talk of sexual violence, and he was also using more and more. He once showed me a video he made, which featured heavy bondage themes interspersed with sounds of distorted screaming, and this strange, leering figure in a plague doctor costume. It was one of those situations where any one of those things by themselves may be innocuous, but as they accumulated together, they became a disturbing piece of art. It was October of 2016 that I finally left there, taking off to a Native American reservation for a pipeline protest. There were mixed feelings of a call to action and wanting to get out of that house any way I could. I gave him notice that I was leaving. My last night there, he was drinking and tweaking again, and eventually started in on the same conversation, loosely describing murder and sexual violence in the tone of some sort of edgy joke. "You know they're going to catch you eventually," I said, not holding back my suspicion anymore. He reiterated that he was the last person that the police would ever suspect, and asserted that they would never catch him. He said this in a very serious and concise way, dropping the pretense altogether. I left the next morning. This haunted me for months, then a year, then a year and a half. It felt as though I hadn't done anything, and the guilt was eating away at me. So I called the Portland Crime Stoppers and put in an anonymous tip. When I did, the operator started going back and forth, putting me on hold, because the phone call had piqued the interest of the police sergeant who was assigned to the call center. So they were asking me detailed questions about his vehicle, the house, the methods he described, etc. It seemed like they had taken an interest. I gave them as much information as I could, and left it at that, feeling just a bit better that I at least tried to do something about it. Fast forward to recent times. I told my mother all about this, and she became very interested, asking what house this was, and she ended up pulling it up on Google Maps and put it up on Street View. I noticed that there was a large enclosed trailer sitting in the driveway that wasn't there before. I could provide a few theories as to why it might be there, but cannot put together a practical reason for it. Admittedly, this is pure conjecture, but I can't help but wonder. I doubt that I will ever get closure, or have my suspicions validated, unless he finally gets caught and arrested. I have interacted with many sketchy and unsavory people in my life, but none of them have ever left this kind of impression on me. Make of this what you will, but I hope I never see him again. This happened over the course of a year, when I was between 15 and 16. I'm 20 years old now, and it's only been recently revealed to me just how messed up the situation really was. I was obviously still living at home at the time, but my sister, who is 7 years older than me, had moved out and was living with her now husband, his high school best friend, and some other guy who they met through one of those find a roommate sites. He was kind of the reclusive, nerdy type who preferred hiding in his room watching Star Trek and playing computer games rather than hanging out with the other roommates. And the only person he ever really seemed to want to be around was his similarly shy and nerdy girlfriend. For a bit of context to the story, when this happened, he was 28 and she was 24. They were both a bit weird, but initially seemed entirely harmless. For the sake of the story, I'll refer to the normal roommate as Frank, the strange roommate as William, and his equally strange girlfriend as Amber. Now, my sister and I have never really had the best relationship with our parents, and at this point things were especially rocky. Our mother was dating a guy who was, to put it kindly, an abusive sack of shit who seemingly hated me and would find any excuse to go off on me. As a result, I spent a lot of time over at my sister's place. It was around this time that William and Amber started to get very strange. As I mentioned earlier, the two of them were always kind of odd. They only ever seemed to want to talk to each other, and would even go as far as to ignore anyone else who tried to speak to them. Amber was far worse than William in this regard. He would at least give you brief responses most of the time. Amber had a creepy habit of just blankly staring at you for a couple of seconds, then walking away if you asked her a question or tried to engage in conversation at all. That wasn't the strangest thing though. When I would stay over, I would sleep on a futon in Frank's office, which was on the ground floor. It happened to be next to the downstairs bathroom, which for some reason Amber preferred using to the one upstairs. She would take long showers in the middle of the night, which was whatever. I'm a pretty heavy sleeper, so I generally slept right through them. One night, however, I stayed up super late doing some revisions to my homework. I happened to be awake when she finished one of her late showers. I was too absorbed in my task to really pay attention to anything else, but I definitely noted hearing the shower shut off because it was an indicator of how late it really was. Approximately 10 minutes later, I look up from my laptop, and there she was. I always kept the door open just a crack, because that room tended to get unbearably hot if I didn't. Amber was just standing there, outside the room, completely naked, watching me through the open crack in the door. I said her name and asked if she was okay, which seemingly startled her, because she then walked away pretty quickly. I convinced myself that in my over-caffeinated, sleep-deprived state, I just imagined the whole thing, and I didn't mention it to anyone. Fast forward around a month later, I head over to my sister's place one night to find Frank a bit agitated about what he perceives to be a peeping Tom problem. He found fingerprints on the outside of his office window in such a way that it implied someone had been pressing up against the glass and looking in. The blinds in this room were slightly too small for the window, so you could see in from the outside, and the room was in the front of the house, with the window easily accessible from the street. He was concerned that some random passing pervert had been spying on him while he was having a private moment in his office, or some potential burglar had been sizing up the joint. The police were called, but since he didn't have any external CCTV at this point, no evidence could be provided, and ultimately, nothing could be done. Soon after, Frank installed both internal and external cameras on the house. This was installed while William and his girlfriend were away on holiday, and I guess everyone had forgotten to tell them about it. A couple of months later, I went to my sister's to find that William's room was empty, and was informed that he had moved out. Of course, I asked why, and I was told that he and Amber were a pair of fucking creeps, and the others had collectively decided to kick them out. Apparently, Amber watching me through the office door was not a one-time incident. The security footage revealed that she did this frequently, sometimes for as long as 20 to 30 minutes. I was just usually asleep when she was doing it. Not only that, but the fingerprints on the window had apparently been from William standing outside watching me after I had showered and was hanging out in just a towel, which was a less regular occurrence, but apparently was caught on camera enough times for it to be concerning. As if this wasn't creepy enough, I was recently hanging out with my sister and her husband. He made a comment about how he wished they would have told me the entire story at the time, so that I could have pressed charges. I asked him what he meant by that, and he explained that not only had they been secretly watching me, but the footage also showed they had messed with food and stuff that I brought over, depicting William licking all of my apples and Amber spitting into my orange juice, even dumping regular cow's milk into my lactose-free stuff, which explains why I had a period of feeling sick out of nowhere. Apparently, when Frank barged into their room to confront them about it, he not only found several shirts I thought I had misplaced were stolen by them, but they literally hung them up on the wall, along with several drawings of me sleeping and poems about me, whose contents I don't know and really don't want to know. After seeing this, Frank gave them an ultimatum. You have 2 hours to get the out of this house and never contact any of us again, or I'm calling the police. They took the former option, but I still feel sick thinking of what they were potentially planning for me.
I used to work at a 7-Eleven here in the United States, and the scariest thing that ever happened to me there was also the single most terrifying thing that's ever happened to me in my life. It happened on a particularly quiet night, and I was still kind of hungover from going out drinking the night before, so I wasn't even paying attention when the guy walked into the store. I heard the door sliding open, I heard his footsteps as he walked up to the counter, and then right when I was about to lift my head up to ask him what he wanted, he just slammed something down on the counter in front of me. I remember the first thing being the red splatter on my t-shirt. It was plain white, and the moment his hand impacted on the counter, all these little red specks appeared on my shirt. I already recoiled from the shock of having his hand slammed down in front of me, but when I saw what he just slammed down next to the register, I recoiled even further. It was a tongue, an actual tongue. Even though it was soaked in blood, I could recognize the deep ridge running down the middle of it. It sounds like such a cliche when I think about it now, but I now know what people mean when they say that they were frozen in fear. The whole thing was an assault on my senses, and I think it just short-circuited my fight-or-flight mechanism to the point where I just didn't know what to do. Then the look in the guy's eyes as he stared at me, so calm but intense, with eyes so wide and unblinking that it was like he didn't have eyelids at all. It was only when he spoke that I actually found the will to move, and all he said to me was, "Call 911. I bolted into the back office, locked the door behind me, and immediately called the cops. All the while I watched the guy on the cameras just standing there at the register. He didn't move at all. He just seemed to be looking down and staring at the mess he'd left on the counter. And given the gruesome nature of my emergency, there was a police patrol car and 2 cops pulling up outside in just a matter of minutes. The guy didn't put up any kind of fight when they moved to arrest him. He just held his wrists, allowed them to put the handcuffs on him, then let the cops take him away. Once he was safely out of the store, I walked out of the office, trying not to look at what was on the counter, then told the cops everything I knew. It obviously wasn't all that much, but as I was talking to them, I noticed a few more police surrounding a car in the parking lot that still had the door open. I called the store manager from the McDonald's across the street, telling him that the cops had to close the store because it was an active crime scene. They rushed down to see what was going on, even though it was their day off, and after telling them what had happened, I went home to decompress. From what I heard later, the guy had gotten into an argument with his wife while out driving somewhere. Then at some point, he'd snapped, pulled up into a parking lot, stabbed her to death, then cut her tongue out. Then, for some reason, he picked our 7-Eleven to walk into to slam the tongue he'd cut out of her mouth down onto the countertop. I was allowed to take a little bit of time off of work after the whole thing, as I just couldn't face going back there so soon. Even when I did go back, I was on edge the whole time for my first couple of shifts, and I just couldn't seem to shake the image of that bloody tongue just lying on the countertop right in front of me. The thing I just can't seem to shake is that it wasn't enough for the guy to actually stab and kill his own wife. He had to reach into her mouth afterwards and cut her tongue out. How completely insane with fury does a person have to be to do that? Like, what could possibly possess someone to do something so horrifying to their own spouse? The guy didn't look like a monster either. He didn't look evil or deranged. All that gave his mental state away was that crazy look in his eyes, the one that had me frozen in fear. It just haunts me that seemingly normal people are capable of things like that. I work at a 7-Eleven part-time in between classes, and earlier this year, We got a little rush of customers in the early afternoon one time. I served 2 guys for coffee and smokes, and at the back of the line, there's this kid, no older than maybe 11 or 12, just waiting there patiently with a backpack in his hand. I actually thought that he looked kind of cute, like a little gentleman out doing some grocery shopping for his mom or something. He gets to the front of the line and I ask him, "What can I help you with, sir?" in a kind of jokey, playful way. Without a hint of emotion on his face, he just reaches into his backpack, pulls out a gun, and says, "Give me all the money." When he pointed it at me, I wasn't sure if it was real or not, because where the hell would a 12-year-old kid get their hands on a loaded gun like that? It's not like the 7-Eleven I work at is in some high-crime area or whatever. It's actually located in a pretty nice place, and although I've heard 1 or 2 stories from coworkers about the trouble at the store, nothing had ever happened to me personally. There was one other guy in the store at the time, and I looked over at him to see him kind of smiling at the kid. Smiling and frowning, like he was amused but disapproved of the kid playing some dumb childish prank. I don't know guns, but I figured this guy did, so I tried calling this kid's bluff and asked him something like, "You shouldn't point toys like that, sweetie. The cops might think it's real." The kid responds by cocking the gun, and it has this real metallic sound that sends this kind of shock of fear running through me. I didn't know of any toy guns that made such a realistic sound, and as if to illustrate that he wasn't joking around, the kid pointed the gun in the air and actually fired a shot that went right over my head. After my ears got done ringing, and I came to, I heard "Give me all the money" in the same monotone, emotionless way, and I didn't hesitate in doing what he asked. I put as much cash as I could onto the countertop, then watched him fill his backpack with it before he just walked out of the store. I think the thing that scared me so much about it was that the kid just didn't seem to realize the gravity of the situation. He definitely seemed like he had something missing about him. Like he didn't understand that he could have actually killed someone over whatever dumb thing he wanted to buy with that money, be it video games or candy or whatever it was. At least a grown-up armed robber understands that a gun is just a means of getting what he wanted, and it's not a good idea to fire it or whatever, just in case they accidentally shoot someone in the face. I get the feeling that even if I'd even tried to resist or tell the kid no, he'd have just shot me, because it's what he assumed he should do. It's almost surreal to me how the closest I've ever come to death is at the hands of a child, someone who should have been so innocent and carefree and full of love, but instead just felt nothing. We're going back almost 10 years ago now, but one morning I dropped my son off at school and then drove over to a nearby 7-Eleven with my infant daughter. It was pretty early in the morning, so there were only 1 or 2 other customers, and one of them was this older-looking guy with a walker who was slowly making his way around the store. I didn't pay him too much attention other than feeling kind of sorry for him. Then I picked up the few items I needed, then headed out to my car. Right as I'm putting my daughter in her car seat, I hear a voice behind me. I turn, and it's the old man with the walker, only there's something weirdly different about him than when I saw him in the 7-Eleven. He was walking upright, not leaning on the walker, and his voice sounded much younger than you would have expected from just looking at him. I remember all he said was, "Cute kid." Then as I turned around, I only got the slightest look at the guy and his brand new posture before he slammed the walker into the back of my legs. The force made my knees buckle, and I almost fell right on top of my young daughter. I'm not exactly the tallest woman in the world, so the height reduction from my knees buckling had me falling forward into my open car door, and I had really tried not to crush her as I fell. I honestly thought that he was trying to get me, which was bad enough, but when he grabbed me by the hair and started to drag me up and off of my daughter, I realized he was trying to get to her instead. I honestly didn't think that I could get any more terrified, but the realization that he was actually trying to take my infant daughter away from me was just too much to bear. I remember letting out the loudest, most ear-splitting scream I've ever let out in my life, begging him not to take my baby. He was so much stronger and faster than he looked, and I guess that was all part of his fiendish scheme to have everyone let their guards down around him. It honestly seems like divine intervention now that I look back at it. But someone was just pulling into the small parking lot just as he almost had a hand on my daughter, and seeing the struggle had them instinctively honking their horn over and over in a bid to break it up. I think they figured it was just an incident of spousal abuse or something, because they were just honking and didn't get out of their car until I screamed over and over again, "He's trying to take my baby." The moment they heard that, they came bursting out of their driver's side door, but then the guy sprinted past the passenger side and out towards the main highway. The second he did, another car comes speeding up and stops by him, which I first thought might have been another person coming to tackle him or something, but instead, the guy climbs into the second car and it speeds off with a screech of its tires. What horrified me in the aftermath was that it was quite clearly a well-planned and almost perfectly executed attempt to kidnap my daughter, and I wouldn't be surprised in the least bit if it had worked on a previous occasion. After the kind stranger calmed me down, they helped me call the cops as I tried my best to calm my daughter down in turn. She was still too young to really know what was going on, but she picked up on my distress enough to be wailing and crying until I managed to lull her off to sleep. The cops who arrived at the 7-Eleven a short while after said that they'd never heard of such a thing happening there before, but they were able to check the street cameras outside the 7-Eleven to try and get a clear image of the getaway car's number plate. I stuck around long enough to find out that the car's plates came back as stolen, and the cop I spoke to said that there was a good chance that they just ditched the vehicle somewhere after wiping it down for prints. If they had already planned such a detailed operation out, there was a good chance they planned for that too. The only saving grace was that the officer assured me that my report was a step towards catching them. A small step, but a step nonetheless. The horrifying experience I went through that morning wasn't for nothing, as not only did the cops now have a description of the guy who tried to do the kidnapping, but their failure to kidnap my daughter meant that they'd probably hesitate before trying the same plan again. I took a lot of comfort in that idea, and if it wasn't for the cop taking the time to reassure me of that, I don't think I'd have dealt with the trauma of it as half as well as I did in the months that followed. But I did a lot of praying too. Desperate prayers that whoever had planned such a horrifying kidnap would never, ever be successful, and that no one else would have to endure the pure horror that I had.
During a time when I was done with college and wasn't able to find a job right away, I took a job at a 7-Eleven because I needed money. I worked mostly late night and overnight shifts. What I liked about this was that there wasn't many people that came in, and I would have a lot of free time by myself to play on my phone or listen to podcasts. I was always a night owl, but I didn't really like staying up all night when I would have to work those hours. Anyways, I'd been working there for maybe about 2 months, and one night I was working by myself very late. It was probably 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, but I don't remember the exact time. The location that our 7-Eleven is at is on a road just off the highway, and we're really busy during the day, but not so much at night. We got several customers early on, and for the first few hours, I had quite a bit to do actually. But now, we would get only like one person every 20 minutes or so, and I started to get bored. I noticed in the back corner of the store where we had the soda machine and icy machines, there was a spill on the floor. Seeing as though we didn't have any customers, I decided to go over and mop it up. I left the counter and walked over to the back near the bathrooms where we kept the mop, then over to the corner where the spill was. I saw the spill. Looked like Coca-Cola. Thankfully, the floor hadn't gotten all gross and sticky yet, and the mop was working well. As I was mopping, I suddenly heard the sound of the front door opening and somebody walk inside. Realizing I wasn't at my counter, I rested the mop against the wall and looked over to see who had entered our store. Where I was, you couldn't see the front door, and whoever was in the front door couldn't see me either. I could, however, just see the front counter. I saw somebody standing at the front counter with their back to me. They seemed to be looking around as though they were looking for someone who worked there. Realizing I needed to go back there, I took a couple of steps over to them, and as I did, I noticed them turn and their head went to the side. They hadn't noticed me, but I did see them looking to the side, revealing that they were wearing some sort of mask. It appeared to be a really creepy looking clown mask. I then noticed that he was wearing a dark blue jacket and his right hand was in his pocket. Immediately I got a bad feeling, as if he was up to no good and possibly looking to rob the place. I froze in place, telling myself